So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thrilled to hear that we have 57 countries and more than 1,800 participants today. As David mentioned, my name's Catherine Devine. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to talk to you. So we're going to talk today about the importance of digital transformation in museums, how it drives mission, how digital asset management is a core element of infrastructure that drives all of this for what we're doing now and where we'll be going in the future. So I hope you enjoy this. And again, thank you all for attending today. I hope you get a great day. So as David mentioned, I lead libraries and museum strategy at Microsoft after a museum career and a long technology career. So you might wonder why Microsoft cares about libraries and museums, and I think my role really is around understanding on a global perspective what are the trends in this space as it respects to technology and digital transformation. And so I must say that before COVID, I had the most amazing role where I managed to visit libraries and museums all over the world, pretty much every day, which, you know, is almost a dream role, really, if you think about it. Now I'm traveling virtually around the world, but maybe one day we'll get back to seeing each other in person. I want to start here with a quote from Satya Nadella, such a CEO of Microsoft, but he just mentioned this recently, just in January, but he's always one for great quotes. But he talks about this second wave of digital transformation that we've seen after COVID, and this idea that digital capability is the currency of every organization's growth. It's not just about museums, it's about all organizations. And I think that this is a trend. It's a little bit more than a trend. It's a real momentum that we're seeing now, that it's almost like, I wouldn't say it's like the dot-com boom where we saw the introduction of internet, but it's not far behind that in terms of being transformative in how we live and how we think about engaging with all of the communities that we engage with. I want to start first by talking a little bit about change and how we relate to change. I personally am someone who loves change, but I know that that is not the case for everybody. And in fact, we know that it is difficult for humans, that we want to hold on to something that we know and understand, and it can be uncomfortable. But I would just like to posit this idea that sometimes in avoiding change and holding on to what we feel comfortable about, we're not aware of what we will gain. And I think it's always good to look at both sides of the equation of that. I'm not suggesting that we just go hell-bent on change, but we also have to look at that other side of the equation. What do we gain? And I think coming out of COVID, we've seen that digital allows us to be able to gain access in a way that we may not have previously. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But we also, I think, have to get comfortable with this idea of being uncomfortable when it comes to change. We know it's going to be uncomfortable. It's not going to be pleasant. We have all demonstrated as a global society how resilient we are after a year of COVID. We've all risen to the can't think of the right word, but we've all risen to the challenge presented by COVID, and it hasn't been pleasant for any of us. I consider myself extremely privileged, but still it's been hard. And I'm someone who loves change and these kinds of different things. At Microsoft, we recently had to do a course around high performance mindset. And in this, we were being coached by psychologists, but also coached by Olympians. So people who had gone through that process of having to achieve the best. But this is the big takeaway for me, is this idea of you need to push beyond your comfort zone to be able to stretch boundaries, to be able to achieve more. And it's going to be uncomfortable and it's not going to be pleasant, but it's going to be necessary. And it's the only way that you can do more. So this really stuck with me, and something that I think about daily, actually. So something to sort of take away here. But I also want to talk about this idea that change is constant. We all know this, but if you actually look back over your generation, over 2 generations, over 100 years, almost nothing is the same as what it used to be. I remember days when I was a child and my mother had to run to the bank before 3 o'clock because there was no ATMs. There was, if you didn't get cash out on Friday afternoon before 3 o'clock, you were done for the weekend. There was no credit cards either, right? So, everything has changed. There were times when we didn't have telephones. It was revolutionary. Radio was revolutionary. All we're seeing now is the same level of change, but happening more rapidly. And so we're seeing it within our own generation in a way that we didn't previously. Museums are looking, on the subject of change, looking to remain relevant. And as we know and have always talked about, we're having to compete with other forms of attention, which is, streaming services, video games. We've seen a big renaissance in video games over the course of COVID. YouTube, all of these types of things. And so, but it's also important for museums to be authentic. And as we know, we're a source of truth and we have a positioning there, but we also are in this awkward phase of having to compete. So how do we do that? And how do we do that at scale? We also know that expectations of our visitors are rooted in their real life experiences. So it's this idea of anytime, anywhere information. We have smartphones, we have smart homes, we have smart cars, we have all of these kinds of things. That's the world that people expect. And we don't need to be like, competing, but we also have to be as engaging as those things are and as simple as those things are. And, I'm not suggesting that any of this is easy. It's not. But what we can't do is pretend that it's not happening. There's an analyst called Wang, who I really admire and follow. And he talks about this idea of disrupt or be disrupted. And we've heard all about the stories about Blockbuster, Kodak, all of these companies in history. We have the same challenge in museums. It's hard as it is to hear. There is a legacy of history here of organizations that have said, we don't need to worry about this, and then being disrupted. And, COVID has completely disrupted museums. It wasn't the disruption we expected, but to come, but it's completely disrupted us, but it's also opened new doors. So I'm not sure that this particular quote is Ray's quote, but I referenced it in a book that he wrote because I think it's a quote that we hear a lot, but it's something worth keeping in the back of your mind. So on that, how are museums thinking about this? I want to talk today about Computer History Museum, which is in Mountain View, California. And, I personally just love this museum because I'm such a technologist and I love technology, but everyone has the thing they're interested in. But Computer History Museum is looking, its mission is around the past, the present, and the future impact of humanity on humanity of computing. But you can see that that's their mission. And Danielle Lewin, who is the CEO of the Computer History Museum, talks about this idea about society moving through this rapid digital transformation and accelerated by the pandemic, and the opportunity that this presents for museums to survive and thrive. And I think that that's a really important comment here. We don't want to just stay relevant. We don't want to just survive. We actually want to exceed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I think, here, why do we want to just be relevant? We want to exceed in relevance. How could we actually think about reimagining museum experiences to actually exceed the competition that we're seeing from things like video games and streaming and other sources of focus that society has? I'm not suggesting that this is an easy task. It's not by any stretch, but let's at least aspire there, because aspiring might get us 50% there. But this is our opportunity to reimagine. And this is not about just putting digital in an exhibition. This is about thinking about how digital and technology can reimagine the entire experience to be better for everybody, the museum and society and all of the missions that we have. So this leads us to the topic of digital transformation, which, is maybe the buzzword of the decade or something like that. It's now got its own little acronym, DX. What is it? It has a million definitions. Everyone talks about it differently. This is how I talk about it. When it comes to museums, I sort of see it as looking as new ways of working, finding new audiences and new ways to engage. And when I say finding new audiences, it's about reaching out to audiences we may not be reaching now. And there's lots of discussion around whether we're reaching everybody that we should reach, whether museums are approachable organizations. What are the reasons about the people that we're not reaching? So it's about looking at how can technology achieve this? It's not about competing with what we're doing today. It's that plus. So it's new ways of working. Like, why do we have to keep doing what we're doing? New audiences, new ways to engage, new channels, etc. All in service of the museum's mission. I am a big believer that technology does not exist for the sake of technology. Technology exists to serve mission. And it's a building block. It's a tool of getting something done. And so museum missions cover all sorts of topics, but generally they can be sort of come down to these kinds of things. Reach. Everyone wants to achieve more reach with their message about their museum. Everyone wants to engage. There's no point of reach without actual understanding. And inspire, and accessibility, and education. And financial sustainability, maybe that's not a mission, but that's certainly an important goal and objective that every organization is laser focused on at the moment. So how can technology allow me to achieve these things? And I think if we look at it from that angle and not from, should we do virtual reality? Should we do an app? Should we replace this system? Should we integrate these? They're not the questions. The question is, what is the best way for me to achieve reach, regardless of the solution? And then look at, oh, technology will allow me to achieve more reach, that kind of an approach. So digital is a tool in the tool set. That's how I like to think of it. It's not the end game. And I think that this is a sort of a paradigm shift that we still need to go through. For too long, we focused on what the tools were and not what we wanted to achieve. So there was a big focus through 2000 to 2010 around websites. Everyone had to have a website. That was great. And then the conversation became about websites. In 2015, along the way around 2012, there was a conversation around mobile web. 2015, everyone had to have an app. Those days are gone. 2020, everyone wants to have virtual reality. I don't know what it's going to be in 2025, but it's going to be something else. This is not a strategy. The strategy can't be what is available, what should I use? The strategy should be, what am I trying to achieve? And what is the best way today that is affordable, not too experimental, that allows me to achieve that and use those as tools, just like we use a hammer. I think the other thing we see this is in social media. You know, TikTok's here, let's be on TikTok. Snapchat's here, that was a few years ago now, let's be on Snapchat, without thinking about why we want to be on those channels. And then we get into this conversation around a competition between physical and digital. It's not a competition. It's not an either or conversation. It's an and conversation. It's the physical museum that stays. We continue to do that. There's an audience to be served there. There's another audience who can't engage with the physical museum for one reason or another. They could have elder care. They could have childcare responsibilities. They could live in a completely different country. They might not have the socioeconomic capability to be able to travel across the world to visit, say, the Vatican, for example, which I believe we're going to hear from later. But there is an audience who, you know, who still is interested in your museum. And I'm sure you've all done this, and I certainly have. I've visited museums all over the world virtually. And I have to say, it's great. I love that, being able to expose to all of those things. And I think diversity of perspective and diversity of experience is such a great way for us to understand the world and be a better citizen in society. So it's never been about this competition between physical and digital. It's always about an and conversation. And there's, of course, a little bit of overlap, which is really about the digital experience in the physical space, but it's only one piece of that picture. So we focused on so what is digital transformation and how can we expand that conversation beyond these very visitor-facing experiences? And so with that, developed a digital transformation framework for libraries and museums. This is the top level view, but covers a whole range of topics here: the building, running the organization, the visitor experience, collections, and all the things we can do on collections. I'm not going to dig into this today, but we've got plenty of content around this. But this is a way of looking at this larger picture. So technology enables mission. And a quote that I love, which is, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. So we shouldn't worry about what we haven't done in the past and how we haven't caught up. We should be focused on, so what can we do today? And let's get going. So one of the things, as I said, we realized with COVID how much access digital provided us and this larger audience that we could reach. And we have to find the right way to reach them, both from in terms of engaging experiences that can compete with other experiences, but also in terms of how can we use that as a diversified source of revenue. But inadvertently, we actually are not fully delivering on our missions by focusing on only the physical building. And nobody intended to do that, but actually, when you think about it, that's what happened. And so I have this idea of a building is just an artificial constraint. And if we go back to the history of museums, the reason maybe why there's a natural history museum in every major city in the world is because people couldn't travel between cities. And so you couldn't travel to Africa to see animals in Africa, but you could travel to the museum in your closest capital city to see giraffes, lions, things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. The world has changed. We don't have those limitations like we did, and we will never get rid of physical buildings, but we can also look at what else, what else we can do. So technology, if you actually think about it, in this particular case of our missions, is actually a key enabler of DEAI. It's a key enabler of access. As I said, it's allowing us to reach more people. So where people were seeing a lifelong learning program that might have had 50 people attend, when they took it online, they saw 1,000 people attend. And at least at the beginning of COVID, I think there's maybe a little bit of fatigue right now, but with these kinds of things. But the idea is like, so who do we access? Well, you know, maybe you've heard this story before. I started attending these Saturday morning sessions at World War I Museum, which is actually in Kansas City. So Kansas City, if you know it in the United States, is in the middle of the country. I'm on the West Coast. It's not something that I could just go to on a Saturday morning, but now I can, right? And so everyone around the world has seen these kinds of things. But if we think of it as an enabler of reach and engagement, that's a great way to think about technology, and not just as how can we have VR in, not that I'm against VR, but how can we have virtual reality, for example. So with COVID, museums realized that they had actually could now reach more people. So, and also more people could access the museum. So even if the museum couldn't find people to attract, people were finding museums that they wouldn't otherwise look at. So this is a great way to think about it. So digital is here to stay. We need to be able to leverage it. It's going to take different skills. We can't do it with the skills that we're doing today. We have to add on additional skills, because like this is like any other profession. There's a set of skills. We need to, work out how things work. We're seeing a proliferation of digital channels. Back in 2000, 2010 kind of era, there really was just two channels. One was the physical side and one was the website. And actually, if you go back before the mid-1990s, there was just the physical side. And maybe print magazines and those kinds of things. But now there is a proliferation of channels. So now we have apps and events and cars and video and audio and wearables, and the list goes on. It's getting bigger every year. And in fact, at Microsoft, we talk about this idea of the intelligent edge, which is all of the edge points of how people consume content. And it's growing. It's as you can see here by this diagram, it's substantial. This is not specific to museums. This is just a general sort of point of view on this space. And so when Microsoft thinks about this, they think about this idea of sort of a central infrastructure that is feeding all of these endpoints so that you can have this seamless experience. So how do we reach really large audiences across multiple channels? We need this ability to scale, and infrastructure is key to scaling. One of the things that I've really noticed in my time at Microsoft is this ability for Microsoft and other tech companies, I guess, to scale, because our audience is actually 7 billion people in the world. And we have 250,000 staff. How does 250,000 staff serve 7 billion people? That's actually a really interesting problem. And so you do it through programs, you do it through infrastructure, you do it through it certainly can't be done through manual, like one-on-one sort of hand-holding type things. And so that, to me, that's just been fascinating to see those kind of problems of scale. I had a similar issue when I moved to the United States in the first .com boom, and I went to work for, I worked for one of the biggest banks in Australia, which had 4 million customers, because Australia is not a large population. And I thought that was amazing. But then I came to work for AOL, which had 55 million customers at the time. And I was like, this is amazing. I mean, this is like 3 times the size of Australia. So this idea of problems of scale, I think, is really important, and infrastructure is key to that. And digital asset management is a key element of infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you have a house of cards. If you're just focusing on the paint on the walls, what it looks like, and not on how you can reuse and scale, you've probably already experienced this. You cannot quickly adapt and publish content. You cannot, and experiences, not just content. You cannot do that. You have, you have to basically let it fall apart and build it up again. And that's expensive, that takes time, it doesn't allow you to be agile. So infrastructure is key, not as exciting to talk about, but key. Dave Evans, also from the Computer History Museum that we visited earlier, is the CIO there, has an amazing technology career. He talks about this idea of a 21st century museum requires a 21st century infrastructure, and I couldn't agree more. Infrastructure lets you do these things. It lets you reuse. So this idea of, reuse, actually back in my, as a funny story, back in my day at this big bank in Australia, we actually had a manager whose title was Manager Reuse. I used to work in the technology team there, Manager Reuse. And I always thought that was an amazing concept. But this idea of how can I take things and rapidly reuse them, not build them all bespoke each time, is an important one. What happens when we add more channels? We already have 20 channels. What happens when we have 30 channels? How can you scale to 30 channels? How can you rapidly adopt those? Infrastructure lets you do that. New media types, we're now dealing with 3D images, 3D experiences, virtual reality experiences. They're all new media types that have arisen in the last few years. What happens when in 5-10 years there's more? Well, I didn't even know what they will be, but how do we deal with that? And then we have this idea of how can I be agile? So infrastructure allows you to do all of those things. Like to think about it as, finances, your finances. If you're an individual, if you're a small business, if you're a multinational, you can't use the same tools. If you're an individual using an Excel spreadsheet or any other spreadsheet for that matter, that's great. You can manage your finances on that. If you're a small business, maybe okay. But there's a point, as a multinational, there's no way that you can run on a spreadsheet, right? The same tools don't allow you to scale, because otherwise you would have to invest so many resources in trying to actually do the finances for that organization that it would be, hugely expensive and prohibitive. So you need that ability to scale. The same is true here. If we want to be able to publish content and experiences in digital, et cetera, we need that ability to scale, reuse. So I like to say digital asset management is core infrastructure. I think there's like 4 or 5 systems that are just like core infrastructure in museums that you probably can't live without. There's more, but these are some of them. So digital asset management is one, collections management is another, anything around transactions that you need to have, anything around constituents. And I think there's one emerging in the future, which is all about digital experiences, a digital experience platform. But we can talk about that at another time. But digital asset management feeds all of these things. It's one of these key systems that without you don't have that scalability. But the first thing you're going to say is, Catherine, yes, I agree, but it's going to cost me. And you're right, it's going to cost you. But let me also suggest that doing things manually is expensive. So it's a hidden cost because it's in your staff and your employees. It's an opportunity cost, which is if everything is being done manually, if you don't have good integration between systems, if you're trying to move things around, etc., you end up in a place where you're not doing as much as you could, and those dollars could be freed up to further your mission in more effective ways. So it's a hidden cost, it's an opportunity cost, But actually, and also technology is nowhere near as expensive as it used to be. There's a myth out there that is still from the 2000s. But as you know, with Moore's law, we've seen a gradual, not a gradual, a steep reduction in the cost of technology and access, and also the skills required to access is much more accessible today as well. So cost is a little, it is certainly there, but it's certainly, we have to look at the other side of the equation, as I've said. So what are the operational efficiencies that digital asset management brings? Well, firstly, a single source of truth. If anyone has ever tried to move images or assets or video, etc., around, they're going to run into these kinds of problems, which is the right version, which is the one that has been sanctioned by the organization, which is the most current version, right? So that's just time and money pinging back and forth. What's the right version? Who has access? What is licensed? How can I find it? If I don't know what I'm looking for, how do I find something, right? It can't just be based on knowing what you're looking for, because that is actually limiting as well. The alternative is, and I'm sure you've seen this play out, and I've seen this play out, which is, you need an asset for something. Let's just say a video of a curator talking on a certain topic. So the first thing is, who has it? Do you know what you're looking for? How many times are you going to go back and forth on email and chat to find it? Once you find it and you've got the person who responded to you after 2 weeks, then how are you actually going to move that file? And do you have the network bandwidth to do that? And then you end up with a copy in your email, a copy in your hard drive, their hard drive. And eventually at some point you just decide, I'm just going to create a new one. And I am guilty of this, I must admit. I'm going to create, but the point is, back to the idea of scale and infrastructure, it doesn't scale, right? And it doesn't give you that consistent experience, that consistent voice. And as I said before, those kinds of things are expensive. The manpower, the person power to actually do that costs you money, even if you don't realize it. So infrastructure allows you to rapidly adopt new capabilities, and we're in a world where there's continuously new capabilities. So let's look at just sort of wrap up with some new technologies that I think really add value as well, because the other thing that we didn't talk about is when you're dealing with platforms and infrastructure, they can rapidly add new capabilities and features in a way that is faster than you building yourself, and obviously adds value. So if you had this problem, you had 100 hours of video or audio that you needed to transcribe, how would you do that? Well, many museums, maybe not this audience, but many museums would go to crowdsourcing. They do crowdsourcing, or they'd find volunteers of some sort to actually transcribe. I don't know if I actually love typing, so I don't know if you've actually ever transcribed anything, but the time to do that is at least for a really good transcriber, 4 times the length of the audio. So that's at least 400 hours of effort. If you needed to find the exact minute in a whole library of video where a curator talks about a certain artist or a certain painting, and it did that 10 years ago, and how would you even know where to start finding that, right? Unless you have the world's most amazing set of metadata. And even then, right, it's a painful process that takes hours and time. If you needed to find a reference to a specific historical event in a whole set of oral histories, or more importantly, you had a whole set of oral histories, but there was an event there that you didn't know about, right? How would you even discover that? Well, short of listening to everything or having one person listen and take notes, how would you even do that? The reason I bring all these things up, artificial intelligence is the way to do this. This can solve this problem in minutes, days, or weeks, not decades and centuries. And it's a speed of scale that artificial intelligence brings that allow you to actually do that speech to text, text to speech, analysis, topic modeling, clustering, all of these kinds of things to unfold the hidden gems and instantly find what you need when you need it. So coming back to our Computer History Museum, Paula Jablona, who is the Senior Director of Collections and Archives, talks about this idea of what the potential of machine learning is and expanded discovery. Some of you may know that in the last couple of years, I did a master's in data science. And so I'm also particularly passionate around this topic. It's such an exciting area. And I found out about all sorts of things in Australian history as part of my master's program that I that I never knew because they're not written in history books. But when I looked and analyzed historical documents, we found about these topics. So it's all about, this kind of thing. So really excited about what Computer History Museum is potentially going to do in this space. So the next thing to think about is, okay, so we can enhance the data. We've got infrastructure, we've got scalability, but this is what are you going to do with this, right? Well, realistically, it can't just be a repository. You have to do something. And so the question is, what is the experiences that we're now going to want to create? And we're going to want to create digital experiences, both for the physical building, but also for the digital space. And how do we think about that? So I like to sort of put it into this idea of like, digital asset management is going to drive marketing, it's going to drive educational materials, it's going to drive exhibitions, it's going to drive digital experiences, whether they be in, and it could actually also drive print as well. But these are the kinds of things. And so I don't really do this justice. This diagram here, I think, does a better justice to this idea. This is not my diagram. This is from, the source here is Terencia, but the idea here is looking at digital asset management as this core, and then looking at everything a museum is going to do and how DAM is at the core of this. And then when you look particularly over here into what are you going to do with that? Well, you're going to tell stories, you're going to have journals, you're going to have interactives, you're going to create compelling experiences from here. So I love this diagram and talking about how it can be at the center of everything, managing rights, managing the stories, artificial intelligence, indexing, but you can see that this is like the heart and soul of the content in the museum. And then I like to always think into the future, and I really like to think about spatial computing. So when we talk about digital experiences, we've often talked about the idea of having a live webinar like on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, or we've had storytelling, as we often see in libraries, and these are great. But now I think we need, and we've also had collections online, and we're seeing more innovation in this idea of experiences, collections online. I actually saw one from the V&A yesterday that I thought was a really great progression in where we've typically seen collections being exposed. And there's more and more innovation in this space. But I think the ultimate in this space is when we get into spatial computing. So what spatial computing is, if you think about it, this idea of looking at a screen is actually an artificial constraint. We've done this and we've never questioned it because we've always looked at screens. But what if we weren't looking at screens? What if we were in the experience? And what we've seen with virtual reality and mixed reality is just the start. But like all technology, as it evolves, you only see a little slice of what's possible, but it's what's coming that's really transformative. But this idea of imagine that we don't have to actually be looking at screens, we live in experiences. And when you live in experiences, that's something that museums can really be thinking about. But you need that infrastructure and you need that content to be able to do that. And you need a way to manage it and rapidly be able to generate those experiences. And so, this is what I will sort of finish up with, is this idea of, if you think about creating truly immersive digital experiences where you are in the experience, you realize that how we're currently managing digital assets actually is limiting us, right? And so if this is the impetus, this is the time at which digital asset management and that infrastructure and that focus and efficiency will allow us to do that, to remain relevant, to be able to scale, and all of those good things. So my takeaways, if you take away nothing else, change is constant. It's important. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Reimagining museum experiences is how we're going to be relevant. You need infrastructure to scale. Channels and media types are proliferating all the time. We need a way to be able to deal with that. And manual processes that we are dealing with now in many organizations, not all, but many, is expensive. It's actually taking us time, and it's actually taking time away from what we could be doing to achieve further reach, mission, and engagement. And digital asset management is core infrastructure, and all infrastructure, not exciting to talk about, but important investments, because those investments pay off in your ability to be agile. They become these building blocks. And with that, thank you for the opportunity. And I think I'm going to be chatting to David, right? I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you.
Great.
Catherine, thanks for that. I wish we had time to go through all the questions that have come in from around the world. And also to call out some highlights of who's joined us that are in the chat room. It's quite remarkable to read through that. A couple of key questions as we have about 5 minutes before we transition to the next session. One is, how can you build buy-in with C-level stakeholders to support dam technology and others that are considered so often a hidden cost in tech infrastructure, and the tacit kind of third rail to that, which is it goes over executives' heads?
Yeah.
You know, kind of a rough way to phrase it, but a few thoughts and observations would be very much appreciated.
I'll try to do this without being too blunt.
Yeah.
Technology, you know, it's a real problem. I'm not sure who asked the question. I totally empathize. It's very challenging because we don't necessarily have technology skills or exposure as a skill in our leadership in museums, but to help them understand, they need to be exposed and understand the possibilities. And so this may not be something that we can deal with as an individual organization, but we could potentially deal with as an industry, is how can we discuss the possibilities of technology, or maybe, I don't want to use the word educate, but educate leadership. I'm going to use it because I can't think of a better word. Educate leadership about technology, how to think about technology, and break down this idea that if you don't understand technology, then you don't have to think about it. I think that's the way here. So it's really through leadership, because it's very, very hard to push up from the bottom. That said, I think that we can think about how to best reach that leadership and support those decision makers in organizations.
Thank you. There's a lot of roads and a lot of ground to cover ahead of us, I think, as we enable the operational staff and the leadership staff at a bit at the same time, and a lot of opportunities to put those governance and change management practices into place over the coming years. And there have been some parallel experiences in a lot of private sector companies, as you and I both know from our backgrounds in this Northern Virginia tech world here. And I think that's one of the things I've seen, that a lot of museums have turned to their board members, many of whom have dam projects at their companies, and they're so gracious about sharing.
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful idea for a small museum, a community museum, or a large museum to solicit those insights, or the tour of, well, how do you manage infrastructure challenges, from board members? And they're generally just so gracious about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have had several questions come in that we won't have a chance to get to about infrastructure through a prism of the challenges, as you've been quite eloquent to describe, as well as the kind of bumblebee eye of, boy, this affects our buildings, it affects our hiring practices, it affects people. And in the context of a couple of those threads that have been very, very delightful to read in the questions and in the chat side, where our next presentation is from Monica Montgomery, and it's called Decolonizing Digital Preservation, and she's with Museum U, and we're going to have a pretty fun presentation. If you're around on chat or on the website or on LinkedIn, you'll find some fun questions that we don't have time to do right now. But on behalf of Henry Stewart and the many colleagues around the world who have joined us today, Catherine, thank you for your leadership, and for Microsoft's investment in this community, and for the map that you're helping us to know how to traverse. It's much appreciated.